The building was never quiet. Its narrow hallways echoed with footsteps, slammed doors, and the occasional muffled argument that carried through thin walls. Yet for weeks, one sound in particular had become part of the rhythm of daily life: the small, uneven cries of a toddler in apartment 3B. His laughter, too, a high-pitched giggle that broke through the monotony of the tenants' routines, had often been a reminder that someone innocent lived inside those weary walls. But then, suddenly there was silence. At first, no one thought much of it. People in the building were used to irregularities. Tenants came and went, habits changed, and lives shifted in ways neighbors rarely understood. Still, by the third day of quiet, an uneasiness began to stir. Mrs. Patel from across the hall noticed it first. She had grown used to hearing the child's tiny fists pounding against the wall during the afternoons while she prepared tea. Without that familiar tapping, the air in her kitchen felt heavier.
"I haven't heard him lately," she whispered one evening to her husband. "That little boy, Noah, isn't it?"
Her husband shrugged. Maybe they went to visit family. It was a reasonable guess. Families traveled, children stayed with grandparents, but Mrs. Patel's eyes lingered on the door of 3B as if waiting for a sign, a rattle of toys, a sudden cry, anything. Other tenants began noticing too. A delivery man mentioned that the young mother, Elena, hadn't answered her usual grocery orders. The superintendent recalled that the blinds of 3B had been drawn for days, a sharp contrast to the usual half-open slant through which he sometimes glimpsed the glow of a television. The quiet was not just an absence of sound. It was as though the apartment itself had withdrawn from the living fabric of the building. Elena was not well known. She kept to herself, avoided long conversations, and never lay, injured in the lobby. Some thought she was shy. Others suspected she simply wanted to remain unseen. Her most defining trait, to the neighbors, was her youth. She looked barely older than a teenager, with tired eyes that seemed too old for her face. And then, of course, there was Noah, her son, her shadow. People remembered seeing him clinging to her side, a mop of curly hair, wide eyes scanning the world with curiosity. Once or twice, he had been seen toddling down the hall as Elena chased after him, her voice sharp with both warning and fatigue. But now, even those fleeting glimpses were gone. One evening, the building's stairwell hummed with whispers. A few neighbors gathered, discussing what they hadn't seen, what they hadn't heard. A man from the second floor mentioned that the mailbox for 3B was overflowing, stuffed with envelopes no one bothered to collect. Another recalled smelling something faint. Not unpleasant yet, but unusual, metallic almost, like damp iron. "Should someone check?" one of them asked. But responsibility was a dangerous weight to claim. People hesitated. The line between concern and intrusion was thin, and no one wanted to cross it unnecessarily. They convinced themselves it was nothing. Elena was young, unreliable maybe, but surely not reckless. Surely the child was safe. And so the silence stretched on, filling the corridors, pressing against the walls of 3B like a secret refusing to stay hidden. Inside the apartment, unseen by all, toys lay scattered across the floor. A stuffed rabbit leaned against the couch, one ear torn. The faint trace of Noah's presence clung to the air like a memory, fragile, invisible, easily dismissed. But outside, the neighbors continued their lives, carrying groceries, exchanging greetings, pretending not to feel the chill of unease that brushed against them every time they passed that locked door. The apartment waited. And soon someone would notice the truth too late. The silence that wrapped the apartment like a shroud had not appeared overnight. It began the moment Elena closed the door behind her, suitcase clutched in one trembling hand, eyes fixed on the hallway ahead. Hours earlier, the apartment was restless. Clothes spilled from drawers, shoes scattered across the floor, and Elena moved frantically from room to room, shoving items into a faded duffel bag. Her hands shook, though not from haste alone. It was the kind of tremor that came from fear mixed with anticipation, the kind of nervous energy a person carries when walking the razor's edge between disaster and liberation. Noah sat in the corner by the window, watching with wide, puzzled eyes. His stuffed rabbit dangled from his arm, ears dragging across the dusty floor. He did not understand the meaning of zippers snapping shut, or why his mother's voice was clipped and distracted when he tugged at her sleeve. "Mama?" he whispered. Elena froze. For a moment her resolve wavered. She looked at him, small, fragile, and utterly dependent. His innocence stabbed at her, threatening to unravel the careful logic she had built. Logic that insisted she was suffocating, that she deserved freedom, that this was not abandonment, but survival. She crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You'll be fine," she murmured, though the words sounded hollow even to her. He leaned into her touch, seeking comfort, and she pulled away too quickly, as if afraid of drowning in his need. The duffel bag was heavier now, heavy with clothes, perfume, the thin envelope of money she had hidden away. She shoved it against the door, checked her phone for the 15th time, and glanced at the cracked mirror above the sink. Her reflection startled her. Pale, eyes rimmed red, lips pressed into a hard line. She looked less like a mother leaving home and more like a fugitive preparing to vanish. "Shh!" Noah shuffled after her, unsteady on his tiny legs. "Mama, play?" His voice was hopeful, fragile as glass. She couldn't look at him. Not now, not when she was moments from doing the unthinkable. Instead, she forced her gaze toward the door. Daniel's last message flashed in her mind. "Don't be late. We can't waste time." His words had sounded urgent, commanding, the kind of tone that made her pulse quicken with both fear and longing. Daniel, the reason she packed, the reason she convinced herself that leaving was necessary, even inevitable. He had promised her escape, promised that if she chose him fully, he would build a future far brighter than the gray walls of this apartment. But his promises came with conditions: no baggage, no distractions, no child. And so Elena convinced herself that Noah would cope, that children were resilient, that 3 weeks, 3 short weeks, could pass without catastrophe. She repeated those thoughts like a mantra as she zipped the bag one final time. Her phone buzzed. She snatched it up. "I'm waiting. Hurry." Her breath hitched. This was it. Elena lifted the bag and reached for the doorknob. Noah stood behind her, small fingers curled around the rabbit, eyes wide with confusion. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He simply watched as his world prepared to walk away. For the briefest second, Elena hesitated. The key turned slowly in her hand. She told herself she would come back, that this was temporary, that no real harm could come in so short a time. Lies stacked neatly on lies, all to cushion the blow of what she was doing. Then the door opened. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and stale air. Elena stepped through, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click. The sound echoed in her chest like a final heartbeat. Inside, Noah toddled toward the door, pressing his palm against the wood. "Amma." His voice was barely audible, but no one answered. The apartment grew still. The silence that neighbors would soon notice had begun, and as the door sealed shut, the first threads of a tragedy began to weave themselves in the dark. The first night after Elena left, the apartment seemed unchanged. The walls still held the warmth of her presence, the faint perfume of her hurried departure lingering in the air. But by the second night, the atmosphere had shifted. Noah's cries began to pierce the silence, sharp, unsteady wails that echoed through the building's thin walls. Mrs. Patel stirred awake in her bed, listening. The cries were faint, almost muffled, as though they came from behind layers of fabric or doors. She nudged her husband.
"Do you hear that?"
He groaned. "It's late. Children cry. He'll settle." But Noah did not settle. His sobs rose and fell in the darkness, raw and pleading, until at last exhaustion dragged him into uneasy sleep. By morning, the building had returned to silence. Tenants bustled down the stairs, heading to work, carrying groceries, exchanging greetings. They told themselves the crying had been ordinary, a passing discomfort of childhood. No one knocked. No one checked. On the third day, the silence broke again. This time, a dull thud followed the crying, something falling, or someone stumbling. The sound rippled down the hallway like a warning. A man on the second floor paused, tilting his head upward. "That kid again," he muttered, then returned to his newspaper. Concern flickered in the minds of others, but like smoke, it dissipated quickly. Inside 3B, Noah wandered aimlessly. His small body moved with uncertain steps across the cluttered living room. The toys scattered on the floor no longer brought him joy. Hunger gnawed at him, a sensation too large for his little mind to understand. He opened cupboards, his tiny hands fumbling with handles, only to find jars too heavy to lift, boxes sealed tight, and silence waiting at every turn. The apartment began to change. Pleo, eights from Elena's hurried packing, still sat on the counter, now collecting dust. A half-empty glass of water grew cloudy. The air turned stale, carrying a faint sourness that clung to the curtains. In the bathroom, the dripping faucet echoed like a metronome, a reminder of time slipping away unnoticed. At night, the cries grew weaker, punctuated by moments of eerie quiet. Noah clutched his stuffed rabbit tighter, the fabric damp with tears. He pressed his face against the worn couch cushions, seeking warmth that no longer came. Neighbors whispered in the stairwell. "It's strange," one said. "I used to hear him all the time." Another nodded but dismissed it with a shrug. "She probably took him somewhere. Kids don't just disappear." But they hadn't seen Elena leave. No one had. And so unease began to thread its way through the building, invisible yet persistent. On the 6th day, a delivery man knocked on 3B, balancing a grocery bag in his arms. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. The silence that met him was so complete, it felt unnatural. Finally, with a frustrated shake of his head, he set the bag on the floor and left. Hours later, the groceries sat untouched, the produce beginning to spoil. Inside, Noah had stopped going to the window. His once bright eyes dulled, his small voice reduced to whimpers that barely carried beyond the walls. The apartment seemed to close in around him, shadows thickening in the corners, air heavy with neglect. On the 10th day, a faint cry drifted down the hall again. Mrs. Patel froze mid-step, her shopping bag in hand. For a moment, she considered knocking. Her heart clenched, but her hand refused to lift. She convinced herself it was imagination, an echo of something she wished to hear rather than reality. She walked on. The silence swallowed the building once more. But silence does not erase what it hides. It only delays discovery. And discovery was drawing closer with every passing hour. While silence thickened in apartment 3B, Elena sat in a dim cafe across the city, her hands wrapped around a porcelain cup she never sipped from. She checked the door every few seconds, waiting. When Daniel finally walked in, tall and composed, her chest tightened with a mix of relief and dread. He slid into the booth across from her, loosening his tie with practiced charm. "You made it," he said, voice low, intimate. Elena nodded. "I left yesterday, for good." Daniel's eyes flickered with something she could not name, approval, perhaps, or calculation. He reached across the table, covering her restless hands with his steady grip. That's what I needed to hear. She searched his face, desperate for reassurance. He's just a baby, Daniel. Her voice cracked. I can't stop thinking about him. He leaned closer, tone sharp but soft enough not to draw attention. Elena, listen to me. If you keep looking backward, you'll never move forward. You said you wanted a life with me. That means sacrifices. The word hung between them like a sentence. Sacrifices. Elena bit her lip until she tasted iron. Daniel continued, relentless. You're young. You don't understand what it takes to build something lasting. I can't just walk away from my marriage overnight. These things take time. But when it happens, when I'm free, I need you ready, unattached, uncompromised. His wedding band caught the cafe's faint light as he gestured, a cruel reminder of the double life he lived so effortlessly. Elena's stomach churned. She hated the way it glimmered, yet she couldn't pull her eyes away. I left him with food, she whispered, almost convincing herself. It's only for a little while. He'll be fine. Daniel's expression softened, calculated tenderness replacing his earlier firmness. He stroked her hand with his thumb. Of course he'll be fine. Kids are stronger than we think. And when his is all over, when we're together, you'll thank yourself for being brave enough to choose us. The words slid into her mind like oil, slick and intoxicating. Brave. That's what he called it. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe she wasn't a monster abandoning her child, but a woman carving out a future. But guilt clawed at her ribs. What if someone notices? She asked. They won't, Daniel said firmly. No one cares enough to interfere. People mind their own business. Trust me, Elena, the world looks away more often than it looks in. She fell silent, staring at the untouched coffee cooling between them. Daniel shifted the conversation, steering it toward promises of travel, a home by the sea, weekends unburdened by secrecy. He painted vivid pictures, words dripping like honey, blinding her to the shadows beneath. And Elena, fragile and hungry for affection, clung to every syllable. When they left the cafe, Daniel guided her by the elbow, confident, protective. On the sidewalk, the city buzzed with evening life, neon signs flickering, traffic honking, strangers brushing past. To anyone watching, they looked like an ordinary couple. But inside Elena's chest, a storm raged. That night, in a cheap motel room far from her apartment, she lay beside him, staring at the ceiling. Daniel slept soundly, his back turned. Elena's phone lay on the nightstand, screen dark, notifications unopened. For a moment she imagined Noah's small voice calling through the silence of 3B, his little hands reaching for a mother who never came. She almost reached for the phone. Almost. But Daniel stirred, muttering in his sleep, and the fragile courage collapsed. She turned away, pulling the blanket over her shoulders, burying herself in his warmth as if it could erase everything else. In the darkness, Elena told herself again and again, "It's only 3 weeks. He'll be fine." But as he closed her eyes, her mind betrayed her with images of Noah crying in the dark, his stuffed rabbit clutched tight. And miles away, in that silent apartment, the truth was already unfolding. While Elena buried her doubts in Daniel's arms, the apartment she had abandoned slipped further into ruin. Noah's world shrank by the day. At first, he moved restlessly from room to room, searching for his mother behind doors, under blankets, even in the closet where she once hid gifts. Each discovery ended in confusion, then tears. By the end of the first week, his energy had dwindled, his small body moving slower, his cries hoarse from lack of response. The apartment itself seemed to mirror his decline. Leftovers Elena had hastily pushed into the fridge began to sour. A carton of milk curdled, filling the kitchen with a faint, sour smell that clung to the air. On the counter, fruit softened and rotted, gnats circling lazily above. Noah dragged his stuffed rabbit across the living room floor, its fabric darkened with grime. Toys that once sparked joy lay overturned, ignored. He pressed buttons on a plastic fire truck, but the sound startled him, reminding him of laughter that no longer came. Soon, even toys felt heavy in his hands. At night, he cried until exhaustion silenced him. His small chest rose and fell against the couch cushions where he slept curled up, blanket too thin to keep the cold away. The once vivid apartment dimmed, curtains drawn, shadows creeping further into every corner. The days blurred. Noah's little body weakened from hunger. He licked the spout of his sippy cup long after it was empty, shaking it in frustration, unable to understand why nothing came. He toddled toward the fridge, but the heavy door resisted him. He slapped it with tiny palms, crying softly, before slumping onto the floor. The silence that swallowed the apartment grew heavier, broken only by the occasional thud of his fall or the faint sound of his whimpering. Outside, neighbors moved about their lives, footsteps echoing in the hallway. No one realized how close despair lay. Beyond the thin door, in the bathroom, water droplets from the leaky faucet marked time like a cruel clock. Noah once giggled at the sound, splashing in the tub while Elena washed him. Now the dripping only marked the passing of hours he could not measure, each one pressing him closer to an end he could never comprehend. Dust gathered on the shelves. The light bulb in the hallway flickered, dimming the space even further. What had once been a home now felt more like a sealed box, each wall pressing tighter around the child left within. Noah clutched his rabbit, whispering in broken syllables, half words, half cries. "Mama, play. Mama." The sound was barely audible, a fading plea no one would answer. By the second week, the air had thickened with the stench of rotting food and unwashed fabric. The apartment seemed to sigh with neglect, every object becoming a symbol of abandonment. A half-filled laundry basket remained by the door, clothes Elena had intended to wash. Dust covered the television screen. The once bright living room dulled into shades of gray. Outside, a knock rattled faintly, someone delivering mail, perhaps. Noah stirred, lifted his head, but no one came inside. The door remained closed, the silence unbroken. And as the days stretched on, the child's cries grew rarer, weaker. Soon, neighbors would no longer hear his voice at all, only the dreadful silence that followed. That silence would soon be broken, not by Noah, but by suspicion knocking louder at the door. The silence from 3B had grown oppressive, a void that seemed to hum beneath the daily noise of the building. Where once faint cries had slipped under doors and through walls, now only stillness remained. But silence, too, has a sound. The sound of absence, of something no one wished to name. Mrs. Patel was the first to speak aloud what many had quietly felt. Standing with her shopping bag in the stairwell, she whispered to a neighbor, "It's been too long. That little boy, I haven't heard him in days." The neighbor, a young man with headphones draped around his neck, frowned. "Maybe they're away?" Mrs. Patel shook her head. "No, she never leaves for long, and she didn't tell anyone. She wouldn't." Her voice carried a trace of doubt, though, as if she were already trying to convince herself. That evening she knocked on 3B, her knuckles rapped lightly at first, then firmer. "Elena?" she called. "Are you home?" Silence answered her. She pressed her ear to the door, straining for any sign of life. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint shuffle, but it might have been her own imagination. Embarrassed, she stepped back. No one wants to be the neighbor who overreacts. Still, word began to spread. In the lobby, by the mailboxes, whispers filled the air. Strange, isn't it? She was always around, then suddenly nothing. Did she move out? No, the rent's still paid. The mailbox is overflowing." The landlord, Mr. Green, grew uneasy. He had noticed the same. Letters spilled from 3B's slot, some stamped final notice. But tenants often skipped a week or two of collecting mail. Breaking into a private unit without cause could land him in legal trouble. He told himself to wait. Yet even he couldn't ignore the smell beginning to creep from under the door. Faint, sour, not strong enough to alarm, but persistent enough to unsettle. He lingered outside one morning, key ring, Evie in his hand, debating. His fingers twitched toward the lock, then pulled away. Not yet. He needed proof. The community carried its guilt like a shared burden, each person feeling the weight but passing it to the next. "Maybe she's visiting relatives," one said. "Maybe the boy's with his father," another suggested, though none of them had ever seen a father. Noah's absence became a subject of quiet speculation, but rarely action. People moved quickly past 3B, eyes lowered, as though the silence spilling out from behind the door might latch on to them. One night, a tenant swore she heard something. A faint cry, or maybe a cat outside. She pressed her pillow over her ears, telling herself she was mistaken. Another day, a delivery driver left groceries at 3B's doorstep, knocking 3 times before giving up. Hours later, the bags still sat there, fruit softening in the heat, bread turning stale. Neighbors passed them without comment, discomfort gnawing but unspoken. The whispers turned darker.
"What if something happened to the boy?"
A woman murmured near the mailboxes. A man replied, "If it had, we'd know by now. Stop imagining things." But imagination is often the first warning sign of truth. Inside the apartment, Noah lay curled on the couch, too weak to stand, his breath shallow. The silence outside mirrored his fading strength. And though no one could see him, everyone sensed, on some instinctive level, that something was deeply wrong. Still, no one acted. Not yet. Mr. Green stood once more outside the door that night, staring at the lock, the sour odor now undeniable. His hand hovered over the key. He muttered, "Tomorrow. If no one shows tomorrow, I'll check." But tomorrow would come too late. And as the building settled into uneasy sleep, Elena's life elsewhere unraveled in ways that would soon force the truth into light. While unease spread through the corridors of 3B, Elena walked through the city as though her past no longer existed. She wore borrowed freedom like a new coat, convincing herself it fit, even as the seams pulled. Daniel had rented a small apartment downtown for their rendezvous. Nothing glamorous, just a space hidden enough to avoid suspicion. Elena decorated it with little things: a blanket she'd brought from home, a scented candle, a bottle of wine she could barely afford. She told herself it was the beginning of a new life, a place where they could grow together. At first, Daniel played his part. He arrived with flowers, kissed her cheek in doorways, and whispered plans of distant places. Elena clung to those promises, letting them smother the image of Noah's small face pressed against the door she had shut behind her. But as days stretched into weeks, the cracks began to show. One evening, she prepared pasta in the cramped kitchen, eager to please. Daniel arrived late, tossing his keys onto the counter with a sigh. He barely kissed her cheek before sinking into the couch, loosening his tie. "You're late," she said softly. "Work," he muttered. "Don't start." She forced a smile. "I'm not starting. I wait for you. Every night." He didn't answer, scrolling through his phone. The silence pressed down on her, heavier than the walls of 3B ever had. She carried the plates to the table, watching him from the corner of her eye. Finally, she whispered, "You said you'd talk to her. About leaving." Daniel's thumb paused on his screen, but he didn't look up. "It's complicated. Timing matters. I can't just blow everything up." Her stomach tightened. "But you said—" "I said I would. And I will. Just not now. His tone sharpened, closing the conversation. Elena lowered her gaze to the untouched pasta. Guilt gnawed at her, rising like bile. She had left Noah with nothing, but hollow reassurances whispered into the air. And for what? For a man who couldn't even look her in the eye when she asked about their future. Later that night, lying beside him in bed, she dared to press again. Sometimes I feel like I gave up everything, Daniel. And you still have everything. He turned onto his side, facing away. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. In the dim light, she reached for her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Messages blinked unread. Her mother, an old friend, even the landlord. She thought of opening one, thought of replying, thought of checking on Noah. But fear stopped her. Fear that if she looked, the reality would crush her illusions beyond repair. Days later, the apartment felt different. Daniel came less often. His excuses multiplied. Late meetings, family obligations, business trips. When he did arrive, his affection was thin, mechanical, as though the spark had already burned out. Elena noticed. She noticed how quickly he checked his watch, how little he touched her now, how his eyes drifted when she spoke. The fantasy she had clung to began to unravel thread by thread. One night, after another argument about promises deferred, she sat alone at the window, cigarette smoke curling into the air. The city below bustled with life, neon signs flashing, strangers laughing. But for Elena, the noise only deepened the silence inside her. She thought of Noah again. His giggle, the way he clutched his rabbit, the weight of his small hand in hers. The memory stabbed at her, sharp and unforgiving. She pressed her palms against her face, whispering, 3 weeks. Just 3 weeks. He's fine. But even as she said it, the words no longer convinced her. Far away, in the dim hallways of 3B, neighbors whispered of strange smells and unanswered knocks. The silence there was no longer just absence. It was accusation. And soon that silence would force its way into the light. The whispers had shifted. What once was idle speculation about the quiet child in 3B became something far darker, heavier, unavoidable. The air itself carried it now, a rancid odor creeping through the hallways, clinging to the wallpaper, invading the stairwell like an unwelcome guest. At first, Mrs. Ortega, the elderly woman on the second floor, thought it was spoiled food left out too long. But the smell grew thicker, sourer, unmistakable. By the 4th day, it reached the lobby, curling around the mailboxes where tenants paused, frowning, whispering behind their hands. "It's coming from upstairs," one man muttered. "From Elena's place," another answered. "Has to be." The landlord, Mr. Harris, finally made his way up, handkerchief pressed against his nose. He paused outside the door of 3B. The smell was overwhelming there, seeping through the cracks, almost visible in its weight. He knocked once, twice. His knuckles met only silence. Behind the door, the apartment gave nothing back. No footsteps, no cry, no sign of life. Just the stench. Mr. Harris stepped back, face pale. "This isn't food," he whispered. His voice trembled. "This is something else." Word spread quickly. By evening, the police had been called. 2 officers arrived, their cruiser lights flashing faintly against the building's brick facade. Their boots echoed in the stairwell as they climbed, tension thickening with every step. Neighbors gathered at their doors, peering through cracks and chains, their eyes wide with dread. Officer Grant, the older of the 2, stood before 3B. He adjusted his belt, jaw tight. "You smell that?" His partner, Officer Mills, younger and less experienced, nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, God, it's bad." Grant tapped the door with his flashlight. No response. He called out, voice firm. "Police department. Anyone inside?" Only silence answered. Mills glanced toward the gat. Herring neighbors. Their faces were pale, anxious, filled with unspoken guilt. They had waited too long, and now they all knew it. The hallway lights flickered, throwing the scene into cinematic stillness. The peeling wallpaper, the worn carpeting, the warped door of 3B, it all seemed like a set designed for tragedy. Grant pressed his ear against the door. The stench was unbearable, clawing at the back of his throat. He shook his head. "We're going in." The landlord hesitated, fumbling with a set of keys. His hands shook as he searched for the right one. I don't want to see what's inside," he muttered. Grant took the keys, tried one after another, but the lock resisted. Mills shifted uneasily beside him, hand hovering near his radio. The neighbors' whispers swelled.
"Do you think it's the boy?"
one woman breathed. "Don't say that," another snapped, though her voice cracked. When the keys failed, Grant straightened. "Step back," he ordered. "We'll force it." Mills radioed for backup, his voice low, steady despite the sweat on his brow. The hallway felt like it was holding its breath. Even the building seemed to shudder with anticipation. Shadows stretched across the walls, wrapping the crowd in unease. Grant drew his baton, striking the lock once, twice, then with a violent third swing. The door groaned, splintered, and finally gave way. The smell that poured out was indescribable, thick, suffocating, final. Neighbors gasped, covering their mouths, turning away. Mills gagged, stumbling back a step. Inside, the apartment waited in darkness, silent and heavy with what it had been forced to hold. Grant turned to his partner, his voice a grim whisper. "Get the lights." The threshold yawned open before them, and with it, the story they all feared was about to be revealed. The door creaked open wider under Officer Grant's push, releasing another wave of foulness into the hallway. Neighbors recoiled, some stumbling backward, others clutching handkerchiefs over their mouths. For them, the threshold was an invisible line they dared not cross. But for the officers, duty demanded they step inside. Grant flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the suffocating dark. The apartment appeared frozen in time, yet grotesquely altered by neglect. Overturned toys littered the living room floor, their colors dulled by a film of dust and grime. A plastic rabbit lay on its side near the couch, its ear snapped clean off. "Dear God," Mills whispered, hand instinctively covering his nose. The walls bore the smudges of tiny hands, smeared in a pattern that spoke of desperation. On the table, a bowl of cereal had hardened into an unrecognizable mass. The milk turned into something sour and congealed. Flies buzzed lazily, circling the room with ownership. Each step into the apartment deepened the officer's dread. The silence was oppressive, almost deliberate, as though the space itself refused to give up its secrets without punishment. Grant led the way, steady but grim. His boots crunched over a toy truck, wheels cracking under the weight. Mills followed reluctantly, flashlight shaking in his hand. The beam landed on the kitchen. Crumbs, spoiled food, a tipped-over sippy cup lying empty. "Where's the kid?" Mills asked, his voice cracking despite the effort to sound steady. Neither wanted the answer, yet both knew it lay ahead. They reached the small bedroom. The door was ajar as though waiting for them. Grant pushed it open slowly. The smell intensified, clawing at them, dragging bile up their throats. The flashlight's beam fell upon the crib. Noah lay still, his small body curled unnaturally, his once bright cheeks sunken, his lips pale. The inn, a sense of his form, so tiny against the sheets, made the devastation unbearable. Time itself seemed to stop in that room. Mills gasped, stumbling backward. "No, no, no, no." His voice broke entirely. He pressed a hand to his mouth, shoulders shaking as tears burned at his eyes. Grant stood rooted, his jaw locked, but his eyes filled despite his training, despite the armor years on the job had given him. "He's just a baby," he whispered hoarsely. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than any scream. The apartment had held Noah's cries once, cries the neighbors had ignored, cries Elena had abandoned. Now it offered nothing. Mills dropped to his knees near the crib, though he dared not touch the boy. His flashlight beam trembled across Noah's blanket, faded blue with cartoon animals. A small stuffed rabbit, its twin to the one in the living room, rested under the child's limp arm. He held on, Mills choked out. All alone. He held on as long as he could. Grant placed a hand on his partner's shoulder, steadying him. But his own composure cracked when he saw the tiny hand, fingers curled as though reaching for comfort that never came. The room spun with grief and fury, a storm neither officer could contain. Hardened men, trained for violence, for chaos, for blood, found themselves undone by the simple, quiet tragedy of a child left to wither in silence. They both wept, not loudly, but with the heavy sobs of men forced to carry what they could never forget. Their tears mingled with the stink of death, an unbearable testament to what had been lost. Outside the door, neighbors huddled, straining to listen, their fear now replaced with something far worse. Guilt. They had heard the cries, smelled the decay, felt the unease. But they had waited. And in their waiting, Noah's story had ended here, in this crib, in this silence. Grant finally stepped back, forcing himself to speak into the radio, though his voice quivered. Dispatch, we've got a deceased child. Repeat, a child. We'll need homicide and child services on scene. The words seemed unreal even as he said them. The crackle of the radio returned no comfort. Mills wiped his eyes, his face red, streaked with tears. "How could she?" he whispered, voice hollow. "How could a mother leave him like this?" There was no answer, only the quiet weight of the room pressing down, demanding acknowledgement of what had been lost. Grant exhaled shakily. "This isn't just neglect. This is a crime, and someone's going to answer for it." The officers stood together in that small, ruined bedroom, the sound of their grief mixing with the hum of flies. The discovery was complete, but justice was only beginning to stir. The night of Noah's discovery, the precinct felt colder than usual. The officers who had entered 3B carried the weight of the scene with them, unable to scrub it from their minds. For Grant and Mills, the boy's small hand reaching out from the crib would haunt them forever, but grief had to give way to action. By morning, the search for Elena Morales was underway. Her name went out across the city, her photograph plastered on bulletins and screens. A mother's face, ordinary, unremarkable, now framed as the figure who had abandoned her child to die. The police found her 2 days later in a hotel on the city's edge. She was not hiding, not truly. She checked in under her own name, as though daring the world to find her. When officers entered her room, she was sitting on the bed in silence, a suitcase open but half-packed. On the nightstand lay a wine glass, lipstick stained, and a phone buzzing with unanswered calls from Daniel. "Elena Morales?" an officer asked, handcuffs ready. She looked up slowly, her eyes rimmed red, but her voice calm. "I knew you'd come." The arrest was quiet. No struggle, no screaming, only the click of metal around her wrists and the shuffle of her bare feet against the carpet. At the station, Elena sat, in the interrogation room, pale under the fluorescent lights. The mirror reflected a woman frayed at the edges, hair unkempt, hands trembling though she clasped them tightly in her lap. She looked younger and older at once, a mother stripped of all illusions. Detective Ramirez entered, setting a file on the table. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "Elena, do you understand why you're here?" She nodded faintly. "Because Noah is gone." Her voice cracked on his name, but no tears followed. Ramirez leaned forward.
Gone? He didn't just go. He was left, alone, for 3 weeks. Elena shut her eyes. I thought he'd be fine. He was strong, always stronger than me. Ramirez's voice hardened. He was 2 years old. For the first time, Elena broke. Her shoulders shook, though her words tumbled out in fragments. I couldn't breathe in that apartment anymore. The walls, they were closing in. And Daniel, he promised me we'd start fresh. I thought if I left, just for a little while, I could come back better. I told myself he'd forgive me when he saw what I was building for us. The detective's eyes narrowed. Building what? A fantasy with a man who never left his wife? While your son starved? Elena flinched. Daniel loved me. At that, Ramirez opened the file and slid photographs across the table. Pictures of Daniel with his wife at a family gathering, smiling broadly. Recent, from the days Noah was dying. He says otherwise, Ramirez said. He says you were unstable, that he never asked you to leave your child. He denies everything. The color drained from Elena's face. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. She stared at the photos, fingers twitching against the cuffs. He lied, she whispered finally. He told me to put him first. He said Noah would hold me back. He said... Her voice trailed into silence, her eyes glassy with betrayal. Ramirez leaned back, watching her crumble. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. But the choice was yours. You shut that door. You didn't come back. Elena broke then, a low sob escaping, raw and guttural. She buried her face in her hands, the sound echoing against the sterile walls. When the sob subsided, she lifted her head, eyes swollen but defiant. You don't understand what it's like to want love so badly, you'll burn everything else for it. Ramirez stood, collecting the file. No, I don't. And a jury won't either. As he left, Elena sat alone, the weight of her decisions pressing down like chains heavier than the cuffs on her wrists. The illusion of Daniel had shattered. The son she had abandoned was gone. And for the first time, she had nowhere left to run. The courthouse buzzed with tension long before Elena entered. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. A mother accused of abandoning her child for love, such a headline was irresistible. Yet behind the sensationalism, a boy's absence loomed, turning the air thick with grief and judgment. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, though the silence brimmed with anticipation. Elena sat at the defense table, wrists free of cuffs but weighted with invisible chains. Her hair was brushed, her clothes plain, but nothing could disguise the hollowness in her eyes. The trial opened with the prosecution. District Attorney Lawson rose, his voice steady but charged with outrage. He gestured toward the jury, 12 strangers who now carried Noah's story. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this case is not complicated. It is about choice, a mother's choice. Elena Morales chose a man over her child. She chose selfish desire over innocent life, and that choice led to Noah's death. Photographs appeared on a screen, Noah's toys scattered across the apartment, the crib where he was found. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some jurors averted their eyes, others stared, their jaws tight. Lawson's voice softened, but each word cut like glass. No. Ah had no voice, no chance. He cried for help, and no one came. And why? Because the one person who should have been there, his mother, walked away. Elena lowered her head, but the images burned into her anyway. When it was the defense's turn, Attorney Collins stood. Her tone contrasted sharply, measured, almost pleading. Ms. Morales is not a monster, she told the jury. She is a broken woman.
A woman manipulated, used, and discarded by a man who promised her love. She was abandoned by her family, isolated from her community, and blinded by desperation. What happened to Noah is tragic beyond words, but it was not born from malice. It was born from weakness. Collins gestured gently toward Elena. We ask you to see her not only as a mother who failed, but as a human being failed by those around her. The witnesses began. Mrs. Ortega, the elderly neighbor, described the silence, the smell, the hesitation. We all thought something was wrong, she admitted, voice trembling. But we told ourselves it wasn't our business. Now, I'll never forgive myself. Murmurs spread across the gallery. The prosecution highlighted her words as proof of negligence too long ignored, while the defense used them to argue community failure, not just Elena's. The landlord testified next, recalling the unanswered calls, the futile knocks. His discomfort was palpable, sweat glistening under the lights. Finally, Daniel was called. He took the stand in a crisp suit, hair neatly combed, his demeanor polished. But the tension in the room sharpened as he raised his hand to swear the oath. Lawson went first. Mr. Reyes, were you in a relationship with the defendant? Daniel cleared his throat. We had an affair, yes. And during this affair, did you ever suggest she abandon her child? His face tightened. Absolutely not. I told her to be careful, to think of Noah. She was obsessed, always, demanding I leave my wife. I never encouraged her to neglect her responsibilities. Elena's head snapped up, eyes wide with betrayal. A low murmur rippled through the gallery as she whispered, Liar. The judge banged the gavel. Order. Collins, the defense attorney, rose for cross-examination. Mr. Reyes, isn't it true you told Elena to prioritize your future together? That Noah would make things harder for you both? Daniel's jaw flexed. I don't recall saying that. So you don't deny it? I deny manipulating her. She made her own decisions. Elena's breathing quickened. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The testimony ended with Daniel distancing himself entirely. To the jury, he was a man who admitted weakness but denied guilt. To Elena, he was the final knife in the back. As the day closed, both sides rested their arguments. The jury's faces were inscrutable, their notes thick with contradictions, monster or victim, choice or collapse. Elena was led from the courtroom, her legs trembling beneath her. Cameras flashed again outside, capturing her pale face, her hollow stare. The trial had become more than a question of law. It was a stage for morality, blame, and human frailty. And as the gavel struck adjournment, the final act loomed. The verdict was coming. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent as the jury filed back in. Elena sat rigid at the defense table, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles glowed white. Her attorney whispered something meant to reassure, but the words barely reached her. All she could hear was the gavel striking in her mind, again and again, like a drumbeat of inevitability. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide her fate. His voice was steady, detached. We, the jury, find the defendant, Elena Morales, guilty of second-degree murder and child endangerment. The words landed like stones. Elena's breath hitched, her head dropping into her hands. Behind her the gallery stirred. Some gasped, others nodded grimly, for Noah's absence, there could be no lighter verdict. Judge Myers adjusted his glasses, his expression carved from stone. Ms. Morales, this court sentences you to 30 years in state prison without the possibility of parole before 25. The life of your son was cut short by your choices, and today the law holds you accountable. The gavel struck. Finality echoed through the chamber. Elena's body sagged.
as though the words had broken her spine. Tears streamed silently down her face, but she did not cry out. She only stared at the table, eyes hollow, as deputies approached to escort her away. Outside, reporters rushed to broadcast the verdict, their voices sharp and urgent. "Mother sentenced," they announced. "Justice for Noah." Yet behind the headlines, the air felt heavy with something far more complicated. For the neighbors, justice was not absolution. Mrs. Ortega wept on her way home, whispering prayers she wished she had said earlier. Mr. Harris, the landlord, avoided the press entirely, his shame etched deeper than any court ruling could carve. They had all heard the cries, smelled the rot, and hesitated. Their guilt was a life sentence of its own. For the officers, the cost was different. Grant and Mills sat together in their patrol car that evening, neither speaking at first. The image of the crib had become their silent companion. Mills finally broke the quiet. "We got her. She'll pay." Grant shook his head slowly. "Doesn't bring him back." His voice cracked, rare for the seasoned officer. "I've seen a lot, but this was different. I keep hearing him, like he's still crying somewhere we can't reach." Neither man slept soundly for months. Both carried Noah with them, an invisible passenger on every call. And what of Daniel? He left the courthouse unscathed legally, but his life was not untouched. Whispers followed him. Colleagues turned cold. His marriage a shell barely held together. In private, he insisted he bore no responsibility, but the truth gnawed at him. He had fed Elena's illusions, and when she crumbled, he washed his hands clean. Yet the stain lingered, indelible. As for Elena, prison walls closed around her. She became another face in a sea of orange, but whispers of the mother followed her down corridors. Some inmates shunned her, others condemned her openly. Nights were the worst, when silence returned, pressing as heavy as the silence in 3B. She would dream of Noah, small and bright-eyed, reaching for her. She always woke with tears on her cheeks, knowing no dream could undo what she had done. Noah's life, though brief, had left ripples. His absence was a wound in the community, a scar on the justice system, a reminder of how fragile innocence is and how devastating neglect can be. He would never grow, never laugh again, never feel the love that should have been his birthright. In the final analysis, the truth had come out. Elena was guilty. The law had spoken, but justice, in its rawest form, felt incomplete. Because no sentence, no verdict, no headline could fill the empty crib in apartment 3B. As the case faded from news cycles, the building eventually repainted its walls, replaced its carpets, scrubbed away the smell that once haunted its halls. Yet for those who lived through it, nothing was erased. The story of Noah was not one of closure, but of cost. The cost of love twisted into obsession, of neighbors paralyzed by hesitation, of a system always arriving too late. The truth had been revealed, but the price of that truth was unbearable. A child's life lost, and a community left to reckon with silence that could never be undone.